So I've been asked by the presenters to be the moderator for tonight. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe they think that because I teach at the college, I've learned how to deal with unruly students. I do teach at the college. I've taught there for many years, history and political science. I'm still teaching there, of course. And when I teach political science, every time we get to chapter 8 or 9 in the text, which deals with the media and news stories and how the effect of the media on people's lives and the political structure, I usually give an assignment, writing assignment. And the writing assignment usually is write about a news event that you remember the most, that was the most significant for you, or that you felt was something that affected you. So most of the students write about Trump's election, separation of families at the border, latest thing, cruising around the internet. Occasionally, I'll have somebody write about 9/11. But that's already 20 years ago. Never, ever has anybody written about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And there's a reason. All we have to do is look around in the audience. For me, if anybody asks me that question, there's only one thing that I could possibly write about, and that's Kennedy's murder. And the murders that took place that weekend and beyond, and how it affected me. And I find myself realizing that as I go on in years, I find out more, and it seems to be even more portentous and have such consequences that it's something that simply can't be buried. And here we are, 56 years later, and we're still talking about it.
Thank you.
So, as all moderators and people at the beginning of any presentation say, please turn off your cell phones. Let me lay out the groundwork for the evening. There'll be 2 presentations. Each will be approximately 30 minutes long. During those presentations, let the presenters speak. Even though you might hear something outrageous, keep the lid on it. And then when the presentations are over, then things will open up for questions. If you can ask a question of one or the other presenter, or both. Try not to make statements. You can always turn a statement into a question, or if you need to make a statement, because we've been carrying this stuff around for a long time, you can always say, and do you agree with me? Or something like that. You'll have 2 minutes to present your question. That's all, enough time. And then, again, you could ask more than one question, but wait until everybody else has a chance, and then it'll just keep going on. So that's basically it. I might remind you of that when the questioning begins. Let me tell you a little bit about our 2 presenters. Adair is a poet and a playwright who has worked in many capacities in Willits Community Theater. He's also worked as a newspaper reporter for 23 years, first for the Willits News and then for the Willits Weekly. He became interested in the Kennedy assassination when he read David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, in 1983. Since then, he has read numerous books on the topic, most prominently including James Armstrong's book, Harvey and Lee, and James Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable. Don Sampson, a resident of the Willits area since 1972, spent 35+ years writing criminal law briefs for defense attorneys in Mendocino County and elsewhere. In that time, he worked on more than 20 murder cases, many of them death penalty cases on appointment by the California Supreme Court. Prior to this, Don served 3 years in the Army, then worked as a reporter and editor for daily newspapers and for the United Press International. Don lives with his wife Annie in their owner-built home off the grid. And Don will begin the presentation. Thank you.
When I realized I'd be giving a speech on the Kennedy assassination, the thought that came to me was, God, well over 3/4 of the people, or at least 3/4 of the people that were alive then are dead now. And I didn't know in framing the speech exactly who might be in the audience and how much material I should put in there that may be redundant in the sense that everybody's familiar with it. So I decided to give a broad enough factual presentation of it to bring some people up to speed who may not have been around when the Kennedy assassination happened. Okay, here we go. On November 22nd, 1963, John Kennedy was shot to death and Texas Governor John Connally was wounded while their presidential limousine was in Dallas. Within hours, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for Kennedy and charged with Kennedy's murder. 47 hours after Kennedy was shot, Oswald himself was shot to death in the basement of the Dallas police station by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby. Oswald's death ended the criminal prosecution case of the state of Texas versus Oswald. And so there was no meaningful way to litigate the facts and circumstances of Kennedy's assassination. Therefore, several days after the assassination, Lyndon Johnson formed what's called the Warren Commission. 7 notable Americans under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, and he directed them to find as best they could all the facts and circumstances regarding Kennedy's assassination. The following day, Congress gave the Warren Commission full subpoena power, without which no investigation would have been possible. The commission then hired 33 staff, 15 of them attorneys, 12 of them investigators, and their first act of business was to decide that all questions of fact were to be decided by the civil standard of preponderance of the evidence. That is, more likely than not, if the seesaw tips that way, you've got preponderance of the evidence. It was no longer possible to be talking about beyond a reasonable doubt. On February 3rd, the committee put its first witness under oath, and for the next 7 months, they put 552 witnesses under oath and examined thousands and thousands of pieces of paper. And at the conclusion of that, they concluded by a preponderance of the evidence that Oswald alone had killed Jack Kennedy, and that they had found no credible evidence of a conspiracy, which is not to say they found no conspiracy. They found no evidence of a conspiracy. And those findings and all the documents in support of them are found in the 850-page Warren Commission report, which is widely circulated, backed up by 26 volumes of documents containing 18,000 pages of transcripts and documents. That's basically the record of the case. When issues were raised about the validity of the finding, a lot of controversies ensued. I, for one, believe the Warren Commission got it right, and here's why. When Kennedy was assassinated in Dealey Plaza in that car, there were dozens of policemen around and many spectators. Immediately, the police went into action, and for the next 47 hours, non-stop around the clock, they created a tremendous evidentiary case against Oswald. That case then terminated, in a sense, when Oswald was assassinated and there was no cause for a trial anymore. There was no trial was possible, so the facts could never be adjudicated in a public forum. And so the Warren Commission was left to do it. And the Warren Commission was left to do it, right? And the first order of business was to deal with the 47 hours worth of police reports generated by the Dallas Police Department. There was no other place really to start than that. That was the beginning of the whole thing. And so that's what they did. They started with those first 47 hours worth of documents. And here's what that first 47 hour investigation shows. It shows that at 12:30 on November 22nd, when Connolly and Kennedy were in their car in Dealey Plaza, driving through as part of a presidential motorcade, driving through the Dealey Plaza part of Dallas, and shots rang out. Two things happened immediately. One is the car, the presidential limousine with Kennedy and Connolly in it, pulled out of the motorcade and shot off from Parkland Hospital. And at the same time, the dozens of policemen that were on duty began an immediate search for the shooter. We're going to leave the police search for the shooter alone for a minute. We're going to follow Kennedy to Parkland Hospital. When he got to the hospital, they took him into the emergency room on a gurney on his back. He had two apparent wounds. One was a bullet wound in the neck here, and the other was a 5-inch chunk of his head here, blown away, about this size, blown away. There was no pulse, but there was a faint heartbeat. They did a tracheotomy, inserting the knife into the bullet wound there and doing the tracheotomy. They did manual heart massage. They shot him up with whatever you shoot people up in that sort of situation. But at 1 o'clock, 20 minutes after he'd gotten there, he was declared dead. The moment he was declared dead, the Secret Service, who was there in large numbers, immediately had the body moved into a casket, and they were ready to take the casket to the plane, and the state of Texas said, you can't take that anywhere. He has to have an autopsy right here. This is state law. It's none of your business. And the Secret Service said, hey, look, we have to get Mrs. Kennedy out of here. She's not leaving without the body. Lyndon Johnson is in a closet somewhere. He's not going to leave without Mrs. Kennedy and the body. And so we're taking the body whether you like it or not. And they muscled the casket out of the Parkland Hospital, got it onto Air Force One, came back and got Jackie Kennedy where she was in seclusion being protected by the Secret Service, got her onto the plane, went and got Johnson where he was being protected by the Secret Service, got him on the plane, got someone to swear Johnson in as president. The plane took off. Jackie was asked, where do you want to do the autopsy? She said, Bethesda Naval Station. Jack was in the Bethesda Naval Station. Jack was in the Navy. That's what he would want, and so that's where they went. The autopsy started at 8 o'clock at night. It was over by 11 o'clock. And in brief, the autopsy results were this: that Kennedy was hit by 2 shots. One entered his high back here and entered through the throat. That's the hole that was used to start the tracheotomy. The other shot entered the back of his head here and blew the big chunk off like this of his head. And that basically was the autopsy conclusion. And so now we'll go back to Dealey Plaza, the police investigation. As soon as the shots were fired, the majority of people, both in the motorcade, there were about 10 cars in the motorcade, and in and around the motorcade, thought the shots had come from the direction of the Texas Book Depository here. In fact, several witnesses said they had seen on the 6th floor at the open window at the east end of the depository a man with a gun, or a man, or just a gun. The first officer into the building was a man named Marion Baker. He was on his motorcycle. When he heard the shots, he looked up at the book depository and he saw a covey of pigeons leave the roof in a flutter, and he thought, the roof. Pulled out his gun, ran into the book depository. He was the first cop in the building. he ran into Roy Truly, who was the manager of the building, and said, "How do we get to the roof?" He said, "Follow me." Truly said, "Follow me." They tried at one elevator, they couldn't get it because there was a door open somewhere on one of the other floors. It was one of these elevators where you have to shut the door to get out. They tried another elevator, the same thing. Truly said, "Let's take the stairs," and they started up the stairs. The moment they got to the second floor landing, the cop, out of the corner of his eye to the left, looking through a glass pane in a door into an area where the canteen is and the Coke machines and stuff, sees a man walking away from the door as if he's kind of just come through it. The cop pushes open the door, says, "Come over here." The guy comes over and he says to Truly, the manager, "Do you know this guy?" And Truly says, "Yeah, he works here." So they go on their way. That man was later identified as Lee Harvey Oswald. While Truly and the cop were moving up the stairs toward the roof, cops were swarming into the building down below, and within 5 minutes they had closed the building off and began a floor-to-floor, room-to-room search for the gunman they believed was there. When they got to the 6th floor, it was 1 o'clock, that's half an hour after the shooting, and they found in the extreme eastern end of the 6th floor, by an open window, shielded from the rest of the floor by a bunch of boxes that had been put up like a kid's fort, they found what they called a sniper's nest, and there were 3 shells on the floor, no gun. They looked around some more on the 6th floor, and they found a gun with a telescopic sight hidden behind some boxes. They took the identifying material off it and started to run a check on it to see what they could find out about it. Meanwhile, downstairs, at police insistence, Roy Truly had called together all the employees of the book depository for a head count, and only one employee was missing, Oswald. I gotta take this off. At this time, it's 1 o'clock. At this time, just when they discover Oswald is missing, he in fact is 5 miles away in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, entering the rooming house where he lives during the week when he's working. During the weekend, he lives with his wife in Irving, a town 15 miles away. But during the week, he lives in the rooming house. So he enters the rooming house. It's now 1 o'clock. It's 5 miles away from the assassination site. He goes in somewhat hurriedly, goes into his room, comes out about 2 minutes later wearing a jacket and leaves. All of this in full view of the landlady who's in the living room watching the assassination news on the television. 20 minutes later, about 5 blocks away from the rooming house, Dallas policeman J.D. Tippett, in his patrol car, is just doing a routine patrol. He has nothing to do with the assassination back in the other part of Dallas. He pulls his car to the side, alongside a pedestrian who's walking along, and signals the guy over, rolls down the window, and apparently they start a conversation. And according to 12 different witnesses who saw at least part of the transaction, after the two had talked for a while, the cop gets out of the car as if everything's sort of okay and starts walking around the front of the car as if to meet the pedestrian around the other side, and as soon as the cop gets to the front left wheel of the car, the guy he'd been talking to pulls out of his jacket a pistol and shoots him 4 times in the chest. Bang, 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 bang. And then he starts running through backyards, and as he's running, he's throwing empty shells out of the pistol and refilling it with new cartridges and so forth. The witnesses lose sight of him, but they go up to the patrol car. They realize that Tippett is probably dead. Somebody knows how to use the radio. They put in a call to wherever the call went to on the police radio, and in minutes the area is swarming with police cars looking for a cop killer. The time now is roughly 1:45. At about that time, several blocks away from Tippett was shot, 2 people see a suspicious-looking guy slip into the called the Texas movie theater without paying for a ticket, and they say to a cop, "We've seen a guy of this particular description go into the theater," and the cop thinks, "Well, maybe that's the guy." So they surround the theater. They go in. They get the projectionist to turn off the lights, to turn off the movie. Then they turn off the lights. They turn up the lights, I should say. And the witness points out the guy in the audience, who's the guy that didn't pay for a ticket and slipped in, and the cops walk over and they ask him to stand up, and the moment they do that, he starts to pull a pistol out of his pocket. There's a fight with the gun, he gets it out. No bullets were discharged. Punches were thrown back and forth. The guy's finally subdued. They get him in handcuffs. They ask him his name. He doesn't tell them. They search his pocket. He has two identifications. One is for A.J. Hidell, H-I-D-E-L-L. The other is Lee Oswald. They radio back to headquarters and say, hey, I think we've got the suspect in the Tippit shooting. His name's Lee Oswald. Somebody back at headquarters says, Lee Oswald? Isn't that the guy they're looking for from the book depository? And at that point, the two cases come together. After that, in addition to that evidence that I've already talked about, during the 47-hour investigation by the Dallas police, these other facts were discovered. The rifle found on the 6th floor was an Italian-made 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano carbine. On March 20th, 1963, Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago shipped this particular rifle to the Dallas post office box in the name of A. Hidell, H-I-D-E-L-L, and did so in response to a clipped coupon and a money order for $21.75. Application for the Hidell postal box was in Oswald's handwriting. In statements made after his arrest, Oswald vehemently denied owning a rifle, even though police later that same day learned from his wife, Marina, that he did own one. And Marina showed the police where it was, or so she thought, wrapped in a blanket in the garage behind Ruth Payne's house, where the Oswald family goods were stored. But when police looked in the blanket, the rifle wasn't there. While searching through Oswald's belongings pursuant to a warrant later in the day, they found two photos of Oswald wearing a holstered pistol at his side and brandishing what appeared to be the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. On the day of the assassination, Oswald carried into the book depository a bag fashioned out of wrapping paper, which he said to a fellow worker at the time contained curtain rods for his room in the Oak Cliff section where he lived during the week. The problem was the room already had curtains on rods there. The bag with Oswald's fingerprints on it was found on the 6th floor of the depository. When police disassembled the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, the rifles fit neatly into the bag. The bullets which killed Officer Tippit were fired from the handgun in Oswald's possession when he was arrested. 5 different people privy to the Tippit shooting picked Oswald out of a police lineup as the shooter. Police found no credible evidence of any shots having been fired from any location other than the 6th floor of the book depository. Oswald, by his own admission, said he left the book depository shortly after he was seen by Officer Baker on the 2nd floor of the landing. He got on a bus, then took a cab ride, and went home because he assumed work was off for the day because of the assassination. Last but not least, the autopsy findings that Kennedy was shot from above and behind supported the proposition that the shots were fired from the 6th floor of the book depository, presumably by Oswald, who was in the building at the time, and whose rifle it was. This was the evidence the Warren Commission had on its plate when it began its investigation, an investigation which, of necessity, required the Commission to corroborate or dispute the facts found by the Dallas police during their 47-hour investigation, and additionally to resolve other questions left unanswered because the state police investigation was terminated before it ran its full course. Questions like, was the rifle in question capable to do the job it was supposed to have done? Was Oswald capable of using the rifle to do the job? In answering these questions and questions like these, the Commission had at its disposal the Zapruder film, 26.5 seconds of 8mm film that contained the entire sequence of the assassination, the only such film that exists. Using this film, Warren Commission investigators were able to recreate the scene with respect to where the presidential limousine was at the various times that someone shot at it or that Oswald shot at him from the top of the book depository. They were able to set the scene by reference to landmarks that they saw in the film. And they could tell when the shots hit Kennedy because when the shot went through his neck, his hands went up to his neck, and when the shot blew off the top front of his head, you could see it clearly in frame, 313 of the Zapruder film, and you could see you can see all the contents of the brain shooting forward, and they actually went forward over Connolly and his wife, who were sprayed with the contents of the brain. Okay. Did the Mannlicher Carcano rifle have the capacity to hit head and shoulders silhouettes at 59 and 85 yards? Those were the two distances at which the shots had hit Kennedy. At 59 yards, the shot that went through the throat. At 85 yards, the shot that hit him in the head. The answer was yes. They gave the same rifle to FBI marksmen. They gave them 2 minutes. They gave the rifle to a couple of them for 2 minutes. Then they told them to use the rifle, and they shot at head and shoulders silhouettes at 59, 85 yards. It was no problem for them to hit the target. Did Oswald have the capacity to score hits at that distance? As a Marine, as a Marine sharpshooter, Oswald had scored 212 hits out of 250 shots at targets which moved progressively from 200 yards to 500 yards. Kennedy was hit twice at distances of 585 yards. The head of the marksmanship branch of the Marine Corps testified that based on Oswald's record as a sharpshooter, shots of that kind were not difficult at all. In fact, he characterized the shots as relatively easy shots. Could the rifle have been fired 3 times within the relevant 5 to 7 seconds? Yes. The Warren Commission investigators found that the rifle could be fired twice in 2.3 seconds. The original bullet, and then the second bullet fired 2.3 seconds later. That is using the telescopic sights. When they used the iron sights, which were even faster, they were able to get the shots off in 1.8 seconds. Did Oswald have enough time to fire the 3 shots from the 6th floor of the book depository, hide the rifle, then descend the stairs to the 2nd floor, where he was confronted by the motorcycle cop, Baker, and Roy Truly on their way to the roof? They recreated the scene. Someone was someone playing Oswald, did the shots from the 6th floor, hid the rifle, came down the stairs, took about a little under a minute and a half. Then from the other end, they had a look-alike or a stand-in for the cop. In fact, they actually used the same cop. He went into the building, he went through the routine where this elevator didn't work, they started up the stairs, and by the time he got to the 2nd floor landing, it was about a minute and a half. So it was a close call, and when you think that at the time the cop and Truly got to the 2nd floor landing, they see a man walking away from the door, the only door that's there towards the canteen area. It's pretty good evidence that Oswald had come down the stairs, since he hadn't gone up the stairs, and got there just in front of him. Did Oswald hit Kennedy and Connolly with separate shots? No. A forensic reconstruction of the event showed that the bullet which passed through Kennedy's neck passed through Connolly's chest and wrist, lodged in his thigh, and fell out while Connolly was on a gurney in Parkland Hospital. 3 bullets fired, 2 hits, and a shot that missed the limo and its occupants. As far as the autopsy, there were 3 autopsy pathologists. Dr. James Humes, senior pathologist and director of the laboratories at the Navy Medical School at Bethesda, was the chief autopsy surgeon. He'd done over 1,000 autopsies. His assistant was Thornton Boswell, who was a board certified in clinical and pathological anatomy. He was the chief of pathology for the Navy Medical School. He was board certified in clinical pathology and anatomy. Because neither man was a forensic pathologist, Humes, the head pathologist, enlisted the help of Pierre Fink, F-I-N-C-K. Fink was the chief of the Wounds Ballistic Pathology branch of the Armed Forces. He was board certified in forensic pathology and had performed over 400 armed forces and civilian autopsies, many of them involving bullet wounds. The autopsy pathologist testified as follows: that Kennedy was hit by two 6.5 millimeter bullets fired from the right rear at a descending angle. The first shot passed through Kennedy's upper back, right here, and exited through the neck at the point where the tracheotomy was used, where the knife point of the tracheotomy went through the bullet hole and started the tracheotomy. The second shot entered Kennedy's head right about here and blew off a huge chunk of his scalp and skull near the front of the head. That both wounds, they found that both wounds, the one in the upper back and the one in the back of the head, had so-called abrasion collars around them, which was forensic proof of entry. They found that the bullet in the rear of the skull had the bullet that passed through the rear of the skull had an inward beveling orientation, conclusive proof that it was an entry wound. When a bullet passes through a skull bone, it creates a beveling, sometimes called a coning or cratering on the side of the skull opposite the side which was struck by the first bullet, much like the effect of a BB hitting a window. Thus it was in Lincoln's autopsy in 1865, and it was in Kennedy's autopsy 98 years later. The Warren Commission endorsed these autopsy findings. In the years that followed, there has been a never-ending controversy about the correctness of the autopsy's conclusion that Kennedy had been struck by two bullets fired from above into the rear, that is, from the direction of the 6th floor of the book depository. The Rockefeller Commission in 1975 and the Church Committee in 1976 revisited the autopsy controversy, and after examination of the autopsy materials by their own pathologists, endorsed the Warren Commission autopsy findings. In 1978, the autopsy issue was taken on frontally by the House Select Committee on the Assassination, which was instructed to apply all advanced technological methods to the autopsy materials created by the pathologists who did the autopsy work 15 years before. To initiate the task and to be sure they were in fact dealing with all of the original documents, the photos, the x-rays, etc., the committee hired forensic experts on dentistry, photographic interpretation, forensic pathology, and radiology to examine all of the documents and materials for authenticity. They did so and concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that all of the photos and x-rays and other materials were of Kennedy. After authentication, 9 forensic pathologists went to work on the materials. As an initial matter, the 9 committee pathologists faulted the original autopsy on several fronts. One, that the pathologists should have consulted with Parkland doctors before doing the autopsy, which they didn't. That the 2 lead pathologists were not forensic pathologists, and they were not. That certain autopsy protocols were not followed to the letter. And that the autopsy pathologists placed the head entry wound too low in their diagram. Despite these failings, the House Committee pathologists concluded that there was sufficient documentation for the panel to arrive at a correct and valid conclusion. And their conclusion was that the fatal bullet entered the right rear of the head near the cowlick area, and there is no medical evidence whatsoever that Kennedy was struck from the front. In all then, 17 forensic pathologists, 2 from the 1968 Clark panel, 3 from the 1975 Rockefeller Commission panel, 3 from the 1976 Church panel, and 9 from the House Select Committee on Assassination all agreed with the original autopsy finding that Kennedy was shot from above and behind. Despite this, conspiracy enthusiasts continue to insist that Kennedy was shot from the front. One of their arguments is that the majority of the doctors standing around in the Parkland Hospital operating room as spectators thought that the two wounds they saw, the one in the front of the neck and the one to the top front of Kennedy's head, were entrance wounds. But they were in no position to say that. These doctors never turned Kennedy over and so never saw the two other wounds in his back. The two other wounds, right? The one here in the head and the one here in the lower back that came out of the neck. Moreover, none of these doctor spectators were pathologists, and none of them did a pathological examination of Kennedy. So their opinions on the matter, when balanced against the opinions of 17 forensic pathologists, are worth no more than idle chatter. Anyone doubting that Kennedy was shot from the rear need look no further than Zapruder frame number 313, which shows the contents of Kennedy's brain being blown forward at the moment the shot hit his head, forward, and being splattered over Governor Connolly and his wife. As far as conspiracy, I have the following questions and notes. Was Oswald part of a conspiracy to kill Kennedy? A conspiracy is an agreement between two or more persons to do a criminal act, followed by at least one affirmative act in pursuance of that agreement. Anyone claiming conspiracy have the burden of producing credible evidence as to its existence. In this case, credible evidence that specific people agreed at a certain time and place that one of their number would kill Kennedy, and they took steps to put that plan into action. The Warren Commission examined possible conspiracy theories from as many angles as they could. In connection with the selection of the motorcade route, in connection with Oswald's presence in the building as an employee, in connection with the presence of the rifle inside the book depository, in connection with Oswald's successful escape, if that's what you want to call it, from the building after the shooting. They examined whether Oswald had any connection, let alone conspiratorial association with organizations like the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, the Soviet KGB, or the Castro people, and they found no credible evidence of any connection in this regard. As to Jack Ruby, the commission found no evidence at all that the two men ever knew each other. The 1975 Rockefeller Commission and the 1976 Senate Church Committee were empowered to look into the naughty shenanigans of the CIA and the FBI. In so doing, they found credible evidence that the CIA had been deeply involved in the overthrow of certain left-wing governments and had tried to hire the Mafia to kill Castro. And they found credible evidence that the FBI had illegally spied on American war resistors, but they found no credible evidence that either of these organizations had any connection with Oswald or was involved in any way with a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. The oft-repeated statement, we know it was a conspiracy, and we know the CIA was involved, but we can't prove it because they're hiding the evidence from us, is not evidence of a conspiratorial agreement or a conspiratorial act. It's evidence of the conspiracy theorist's state of mind. Acronyms don't kill people. People kill people. The vital element of any conspiracy agreement cannot be left to speculation. He who asserts the existence of a criminal agreement to kill Kennedy, whether involving Oswald or anyone else, has the burden of producing credible evidence of who, where, when, and what. Perceived motives to kill Kennedy are not in and by themselves evidence of an agreement to kill Kennedy or evidence of having done so. If President Trump were assassinated, would everybody with a perceived motive to kill him be considered a suspect? Nancy Pelosi, the whistleblower, former FBI Director James Comey, Stormy Daniels, and Democrats who had spoken out forcefully against Trump, including perhaps people in this room. Or the military-industrial complex concerned that Trump might be reducing our military footprint around the world. As a matter of common sense, consider the following. If the alleged conspirators were rational people, why would they team up with someone with as high a profile with the intelligence and security agencies as Oswald? In 1959, after Oswald got out of the Marines, he defected to the Soviet Union and told the American embassy in Moscow that he was renouncing his citizenship and he intended to tell the Soviets everything he knew about his classified work at a military radio station. Radar station, it should be. A year and a half later, after working in a factory in the Soviet hinterlands, Oswald returned to the American embassy in Moscow with a Russian wife, Marina, and said he'd changed his mind and wanted to go back to the good old USA. Those two acts, defection, then return, automatically put Oswald in a category in which he would be monitored by the CIA and the FBI. Is this the kind of person wannabe conspirators would want to conspire with? Once Oswald defected, the CIA opened a 201 file on him and thereafter kept track of him through newspaper clippings and official documents from other agencies. When Oswald returned to the United States, the FBI opened a file on him. Conspiracy theorists allege that the existence of a CIA 201 file on Oswald is proof that Oswald was working for the CIA. This is nonsense. The FBI opened a file on me in the process of my getting a top security clearance for the work I needed to do in the Army Security Agency, the military wing of the National Security Agency. That didn't mean I was working for the FBI, or the CIA, or the CIA, or that I was conspiring with these federal agencies. And if there was a conspiracy involving Oswald to kill Kennedy, when did it begin? Before he was hired to work in the book depository on October 15th, just 5 weeks before the assassination? After the presidential motorcade route was published several days before the assassination? Or was he just a hangabout conspirator, hoping that someday, maybe, he would have a chance to shoot the president if he happened to see him? What rational conspirators would arm Oswald with a $21 surplus Italian military carbine and leave him with only $13 in his pocket? What rational conspiracy plan would have the shooter more than 50 yards from his target rather than up close and personal for a pistol shot, preferably to the head? Think President Garfield. Think President Kinley. Think President Lincoln. Think Bobby Kennedy. Think of the attempted assassination on President Reagan. Since there could be no rational escape plan after killing Kennedy in front of dozens of cops and scores of spectators, why not do the deed up close and personal where you can't miss? Even sharpshooters can miss distant shots. Oswald was a sharpshooter, but one of his 3 shots at targets under 100 yards away missed everything, the limousine and its 6 passengers. Before the Warren Commission was a dream in anyone's mind, the Dallas police authorities put together an overwhelming 47-hour evidentiary case that Oswald alone killed Kennedy by shooting him twice from the 6th floor of the book depository. The Warren Commission corroborated and augmented this evidence, and despite a 7-month search, was unable to find any evidence of a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, a conspiracy involving Oswald or anyone else. I believe the evidence strongly suggests that Oswald was a disturbed, angry, lone wolf killer. On March 20th, he bought the rifle. 20 days later, on April 10th, he used his new toy to take a shot at night at Major General Edwin Walker, an outspoken general, right-wing general, kicked out of the army for indoctrinating the troops in the virtues of the John Birch Society, a militantly anti-communist organization. That shot missed. And after things calmed down, Oswald brought the rifle back into the house from the place where he'd hidden it after the shooting. Shortly after this event, the Oswalds moved for a time to New Orleans, where, according to Marina, Lee would sit out on the back porch at night in total darkness, dry firing the rifle. Inside, Maria could hear the hammer clicks each time Lee pulled the trigger. Shortly after this, somewhere during this period, Lee told Marina he was going to shoot Nixon when Nixon came to town. She wept and said, "We have a child, you can't do that." And he called it off. Later, in testimony before the Warren Commission, Marina said Lee might have been talking about Governor Connolly at the time, not Nixon, but he was talking about shooting one or the other. What seems clear is this: Oswald was ready, willing, and eager to shoot political figures, particularly important ones, if the right occasion arose. And suddenly, there it was, the occasion of a lifetime. Everything he dreamed about all those nights, he dry-fired his rifle at the enemies in his mind. Not only was President Kennedy coming to Dallas, he was going to pass right by the book depository in an open limousine. Now that's what you call opportunity. There have been more than 1,000 books published and published articles about the Kennedy assassination, and there will undoubtedly be thousands more. Most of these publications contend the assassination was the result of a conspiracy, but the theorists vigorously disagree on which conspiracy. And so their theories tend to cancel each other out. As I see it, the endless multiplication of competing conspiracy theories is itself persuasive evidence there was no conspiracy. Criminal conspiracies are fragile edifices, and the more persons that are involved in a particular conspiracy, the more fragile is that edifice. People talk, just as loose lips sink ships, they sink conspiracies too. And as the Hell's Angels say, two people can only keep a secret, but one of them are dead. If there had been a real conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and I emphasize the word real, I believe we would have found out about it a long time ago. But no, there has been nothing but endless speculation piled upon endless speculation. So the search for conspirators, the holy grail of the Kennedy assassination conspiracy buffs, goes on, and probably will until global warming puts a stop to it. As for possible conspirators, I have a list here of 340 different suspects named in books and publications, and this is only a partial list. For anyone who wants to see the list, it's right here. And to those of you of my generation, I say you might want to scan the list to see if your name is on it. I checked for mine and it wasn't there. To close the circle and get back to where I started, I believe the evidence overwhelmingly supports the Warrens Commission conclusion, found by a preponderance of the evidence, that Oswald alone killed Kennedy, and that there was no credible evidence of a conspiracy. Thank you.
All right. Well, okay. I have to say, that Don did a wonderful job, and congratulations, Don. So my goal here tonight is to falsify the Warren report. And to do that, I want to look at the three main conclusions of the report. Kennedy and Connolly suffered 7 wounds from a single bullet. That the bullet that hit JFK hit him in the back of the skull and was fired from the rear, and that the shooter was Lee Harvey Oswald. So first of all, we're going to look at the so-called magic bullet, the one that made 7 wounds in 2 bodies. According to the commission, it hit Kennedy at the base of the neck, and it went through the neck, left an exit wound here in the front of the throat. Then it traveled on, hit John Connolly in the back. It went through his torso and shattered a rib. It continued on, and it left his body near the right nipple, entered his right arm at the wrist, shattered the wrist bone, left the wrist, and stopped traveling in his thigh. 7 wounds, and when it was discovered, there was no blood on it. No bone fragments, no tissue. It had lost almost none of its mass, and it was in perfect physical form. That's why it's called the magic bullet. So many facts can be presented that falsify this supernatural missile. First, at least 2 physicians who attended Kennedy in Dallas at the Parkland Hospital say that Kennedy was shot in the neck in front. Dr. Malcolm Perry, who was the lead physician in the effort to save Kennedy's life, was quoted in the San Francisco Chronicle on November 23rd, the day after the shot. He said, there was an entrance wound below his Adam's apple. On the next day, he was quoted in the Dallas News. In the lower portion of Kennedy's neck, right in front, there was a small puncture. A second doctor who was present on that day and in that room said the same thing. Dr. Charles Carrico said that, quote, there was a small penetrating wound of the anterior neck in the lower 1/3, which is doctor talk for there was an entrance wound in the front of the neck. That means at least 2 doctors who were in the emergency room on that day said that Kennedy was shot in front, from in front. Secondly, in the initial stages of the commission's investigation, there was strong eyewitness evidence that Kennedy was shot in the mid-back. Not in the base of the neck, but lower down, in the mid-back to the right of the spine. For example, there's the statement from Secret Service agent Clint Hill. Hill was the guy who jumped onto the trunk of the limousine and pushed Mrs. Kennedy back into the seat, the rear seat of the car. And he said he was given an opportunity to view the wounds on the cadaver early in the a.m. on November 23rd. And when he examined the body at the morgue at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he told the Warren Commission, quote, I saw an opening in the back about 6 inches below the neckline at the right-hand side of the spinal column. Okay? Now, JFK's physician, Dr. George Berkeley, was present at Parkland Memorial when Kennedy was being treated there, and he wrote out a death certificate, and he described the president's wounds. The exact quote is, quote, a second wound occurred in the posterior back at about the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. Berkeley's certificate of death does not appear in the Warren Commission report. Fourth, the FBI released a preliminary report in December '63 which affirmed that Kennedy was shot in the mid-back. The report stated, quote, medical examination of the president's body revealed that one of the bullets had entered just below his shoulder to the right of the spinal column at an angle of 45 to 60 degrees downward, that there was no point of exit, and that the bullet was not in the body. So that's a preliminary report from the FBI. The fifth way in which the commission's conclusions can be falsified is that both Kennedy's suit coat and his shirt had one bullet hole in the back at about 6 inches down from the shoulder and slightly to the right. Cindy, if you could turn that one now. This is an image of Kennedy's suit coat and shirt. You can see for yourselves. Here's a bullet hole. I don't know if you can see it. There's a bullet hole. Goes up to there. And then this is the shirt he was wearing. And it looks to me like the most intense flow of blood is right in this area, which is right in this area, not at the base of the neck. Thank you. Now, the sixth way in which the commission's conclusions can be falsified is to note that what the magic bullet is supposed to have done was not replicated in laboratory experiments conducted by the commission. Tests were performed by Dr. Alfred Olivier, who was the chief of Wounds Ballistic Branch of the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. And Olivier used Oswald's alleged murder weapon, the Mannlicher Carcano, to fire 6.5 millimeter rounds into the wrists of 10 cadavers. In every case, after going through the wrists of those cadavers, the retrieved bullets were badly deformed. And the seventh way that the magic bullet theory can be falsified is to argue that, well, It just doesn't add up. Remember, when it was found, the bullet had no blood on it, no bone, no flesh. It was pristine. How pristine was it? The weight of this bullet before it was fired, when it came out of the factory, was between 160 and 161 grains. When weighed by the Warren Commission, it weighed 158.6 grains. So how much is a grain? A grain is 0.065 of a gram, or 1/7,000th of a pound. Let's think of it another way. And I thought of this myself. I think it's incredibly brilliant. An average postage stamp weighs 1 gram. So you take this average postage stamp and you cut it into 10 equal parts. And then you take one of those parts and you cut out about 1/3 of it, right? That will leave you about 2/3 of 1/10 of one postage stamp. And that is 1 grain. So the commission is asking us to believe that after passing through 2 bodies and making 7 wounds, and after cracking a rib and shattering a wrist bone, that the bullet lost only about 2 of those little tiny pieces of 1 postage stamp. So a lot of people have had some trouble with the magic bullet. I want to share a couple of comments with you. One was that of Audrey Bell, who was a Dallas nurse who assisted with removing bullet fragments from Connolly's body. Whereas the Warren Commission claimed that there were 3 fragments, Bell said that there were between 4 and 5 fragments. She also said that they were larger than fragments that could have been made out of the 1.4 to 2.4 grains that were lost by Exhibit 399, the magic bullet. Quote, they were small fragments, anywhere from 3 to 4 millimeters in length and only a couple of millimeters wide, she said. The smallest was the size of a striking head of a match, and the largest was at least twice that big. And I've seen a picture of the magic bullet, and I can't see how it could be the bullet from which the fragments that I saw came. It is interesting to note that the Warren Commission never called on Nurse Bell as a witness. In addition to the bullet fragments that Bell helped to remove from Connolly's body, several fragments were left in Connolly's wrist and thigh, and he carried them around with him for the rest of his life. They were in his body. According to assassination expert and author Robert Groden, the total estimated weight of the fragments that were in Governor Connolly's wrist, based upon his x-rays, and added to the weight of the fragments that were removed from his wrist at the time of the assassination and those that remained in his thigh, is far greater than the weight that is missing from the single pristine bullet, which is, as we have stated, between 1.4 and 2.4 grains. This would indicate that at least some of the fragments came from at least one other bullet. So I've just given you 7 different pieces of evidence that support the theory that the magic bullet is wrong, that the magic bullet theory is wrong. There is considerable eyewitness, professional, expert evidence that Kennedy was shot in the back, just below the shoulder blade, and that he was also shot in the front of the neck. The Warren Commission says it didn't happen that way. And it says it was a single bullet, hit him here, went through his neck, came out in front. It's hard to imagine how the commission could have gotten such an important element in the case so wrong. And it's equally hard to imagine how those medical professionals could have misinterpreted the wounds in a routine case like the assassination of a president of the United States. Maybe Dr. Perry and Dr. Carrico didn't know what an entry bullet wound looked like, but they did know. And they had seen hundreds of bullet wounds, both entry wounds and exit wounds in their career, prior to having dealt with the shooting of President Kennedy. So we end up here with a major problem. Let's call it cognitive dissonance. We have 2 views of the assassination that are mutually exclusive, and we have to end up rejecting one or the other, and to do that we have to rely on non-scientific reasoning, on feelings, or on one's worldview. And it's a problem that can drive you crazy. So for the moment, I don't want to go crazy, so let's forget about the magic bullet for a moment, and we'll move on to the shot that killed Kennedy, the headshot. The Warren report concluded that the second bullet entered Kennedy's head low down here by his hairline in the back of the head, and it blew out his right temple. The report published artist drawings showing the back of Kennedy's head punctured by a bullet, and it also published x-rays of Kennedy's skull, showing that the back of the head was intact and that there was a massive exit wound in the temple. The claim that the headshot bullet acted as reported by the commission can be falsified in, again, 7 ways. I'm going to take a sip here. Thank you. First, 31 people, including doctors and nurses and ambulance drivers and FBI agents and x-ray technicians who treated or who saw Kennedy that day, said that they saw a large exit wound in the back of Kennedy's skull. This wound was about the size of a baseball, and a great deal of the president's brain matter was oozing and dripping out of the hole in the back of his head. Secondly, there's the Harper fragment. Dallas resident Billy Harper, he found a large bone fragment in the Dealey Plaza lawn, 35 feet to the left and the rear of the point of impact where Kennedy was hit. Harper found this fragment on Saturday, the day after the assassination, and he gave the fragment to his uncle, Dr. Jack Harper, who worked at the Methodist Hospital in Dallas. And Harper gave the fragment to A.B. Cairns, chief pathologist at the hospital. The 2 men agreed that this fragment was part of the occipital bone, which is a bone at the base of the skull, right here in back. It's that one that kind of you can almost lift up on. Assuming that the occipital bone fragment that Harper found was from Kennedy's skull, I think that's a reasonable assumption. It corroborates a statement from the 31 eyewitnesses as to the assassination to build an argument that the headshot that blew out Kennedy's brain came from in front. Third, there's the reaction of Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline. Those of us who have seen the Zapruder film will remember that immediately after JFK was shot, Mrs. Kennedy climbed out of the back seat and scrambled down the trunk. Mrs. Kennedy was retrieving a piece of her husband's skull. We know this is true because she did retrieve it, and she held on to it until she gave it to Dr. Marion Jenkins at Parkland Hospital. It's important to note here that the skull fragment was blown backwards onto the trunk of the limousine, which supports the idea that the president was shot from in front. Fourth, there is another statement from Clint Hill. Here's what Hill said. The right rear portion of Kennedy's head was missing. It was lying in the rear seat of the car. His brain was exposed. At the moment, another piece of evidence is this. At the moment of impact, Bobby Hargis, one of the Dallas policemen that was providing a motorcycle escort, was struck in the face by a sheet of blood and brain tissue. Hargis was riding to the left rear of the presidential limousine. The fact that he was hit by bodily debris from the president, which hit him as it was traveling rearward, is consistent with the idea that the headshot came from in front. Sixth, more than 200 people who were at Dealey Plaza at that moment went running toward the grassy knoll. Grassy knoll was right here. Okay, so that was in front, right, and to the right. Finally, there's a Zapruder film, the home movie taken by Dallas dressmaker Abraham Zapruder. The movie shows that Kennedy, at the precise nanosecond that the headshot hit him, and it shows that his head moves to the rear and to the left in reaction to the impact. This is consistent with a bullet that comes from in front and from the right. So here again, we see that even in this brief review of the assassination, we can falsify the magic bullet and the headshot in many ways. I've given you 14 pieces of evidence in just a few minutes, and if I had more time, I could probably give you twice as much. But again, we have cognitive dissonance. And again, our worldview starts to tear apart. It's much easier to believe that the Warren Commission was right. After all, they published drawings showing that the back of the head was intact. And they published x-rays. This was the United States government was doing this commission of inquiry, and they were getting their information from the FBI. It is simply not possible that the Warren report could be wrong, because we all know that the US government doesn't lie, right? All right, let's abandon our efforts to make sense out of these two shots that allegedly hit Kennedy, and let's instead look at the third leg of the Warren Commission argument, the man who allegedly shot the president, Lee Harvey Oswald. As Don said, Oswald is a mysterious figure. He was a Marine who joined the branch while he was in his teens. He was stationed in the Far East, in the Philippines, and in Japan. He was a radar man who we now know served in the Marine base in Atsugi, Japan, where we kept our high-altitude spy plane, the U-2, and we also had a CIA station there. His mother fell at work in December of 1958, and she did not get well, or she pretended to not get well, for many months. And in the summer of 1959, Oswald applied to the Marine Corps for permission to leave the service so he could provide for her. He applied on August 17th, 1959. His dependency discharge was granted on August 31st. This is amazing. According to Lieutenant Colonel Bolish Kozak, it normally takes 3 to 6 months for the Marine Corps to grant a dependency discharge. Oswald got his in 2 weeks. Well, so instead of staying home to take care of his mother, he went to Russia. He took a ship to France across the English Channel. He flew to Helsinki, Finland, where on October 13th, 1959, he applied for an in-tourist visa to the Soviet Union. He got the visa the next day. This is, by all accounts, really astounding. Oswald somehow knew that the only Soviet consul in the world who was authorized by his government to issue visas in a matter of hours was this consul, based in Helsinki, Finland. How did he know that? On October 31st, at the American Embassy in Moscow, Oswald attempted to defect to the Soviet Union. While there, he told American embassy officials, as Don said, that he was planning to share military secrets with the Soviets. Interestingly, the American consul did not have Oswald arrested, but instead allowed him to stay in Moscow and continue to attempt to defect. He surrendered his passport to the American consul. He was granted permission to live in the Soviet Union, but he was not granted citizenship. He was sent to Minsk, where he worked in a radio factory for nearly 3 years. In June of '62, he was allowed to return to the US. In fact, the State Department paid for his return trip. According to all available public records, he was not debriefed by US intelligence upon his return. He was not prosecuted by the US government. According to John Armstrong, author of the book that I recommend to you, Harvey and Lee, Oswald should have been prosecuted for 2 things. He should have been prosecuted for fraudulent separation from the armed forces due to false representation. And he should have been prosecuted for threatening to share military secrets with the government of an enemy of the United States. When Oswald and his family returned from the Soviet Union, they were met at the dock in Hoboken, New Jersey by Spaz Rakin, an employee of the Travelers Aid Society, and also the Secretary General of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations, a right-wing anti-communist organization. So I'd like to ask you, why would the supposed pro-communist Oswald be welcomed back to the US by the anti-communist Rakin? After moving to Fort Worth, Texas, Oswald was befriended by CIA asset George de Mohrenschildt. De Mohrenschildt admitted that he befriended Oswald at the suggestion of CIA officer J. Walton Moore. One of the most fantastic elements about Oswald is that while he was in New Orleans, he started a chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It is notable that Oswald and another man, A.J. Hidell, were the only members of this branch of the FPCC. That is, if Hidell was a real person and not an Oswald alias. It's also remarkable that, as was pointed out in Jim Garrison's book On the Trail of the Assassins, that Oswald set up his office in a spare room that was located directly above the office of Guy Bannister, the hard-nosed, anti-communist, former FBI man from Chicago. And as Garrison pointed out, it is incredible that a man who in 1963 was attempting to garner public support for Fidel Castro and a socialist Cuba would choose as his office a room located right in the heart of the intelligence community of New Orleans. In Bannister's building, and across the street and down the block from the New Orleans CIA station, and the New Orleans branch of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Kind of an odd choice. In late September of '63, Oswald allegedly went to Mexico City by bus, where at the Cuban consulate he attempted to secure a visa into the Soviet Union. But Sylvia Odio, the daughter of an anti-Castro Cuban businessman Amador Odio, met with the man claiming to be Leon Oswald at her home. During the evening, at her home in Dallas, during the evening of September 26, 1963, when Oswald allegedly was en route to Mexico City. Odio maintained that the man that came to her apartment was the same man who later shot the president. At the same time, while he was visiting Odio, he was also en route to Mexico City. And when he got there, neither the Cubans nor the Russians would give him a visa. And when he was refused, he got very surly. And he started yelling at the woman who refused him, Cuban Consulate Secretary Sylvia Duran. When Duran would do nothing for him, he demanded to see Duran's boss, Cuban Consul Eusebio Azcue Lopez. Azcue talked to Oswald and the two men argued. And after the assassination, Azcue was shown photographs of Oswald, and he did not recognize him as the man who presented himself at the embassy and who got into an argument with him. And in 1977, Azcue testified to the House Select Committee to this effect. There's a couple of other mysteries about Oswald that I want to bring up before I bring in the heavy artillery. And one is, Oswald did seem to be able to move around amazingly well, especially for a man who didn't drive. For example, according to the visitor's book at the Atomic Energy Museum at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, on July 26, 1963, a visitor signed the book Lee H. Oswald, USSR, Dallas Road, Dallas, Texas. Now, on the same day, Lee Harvey Oswald cashed his final paycheck from Riley Coffee, where he was working in New Orleans. He cashed the check at the Winn-Dixie store on Magazine Street in New Orleans. Oswald did not drive, and there is no record that someone else drove him from New Orleans to Oak Ridge, Tennessee on that day, or on any other day. The one-way distance between those cities is 596 miles. So we do know that the next day, Saturday, July 27th, his aunt and uncle, Lillian and Dutz Murrett, drove he and Marina to Mobile, Alabama, so he could give a talk on life in Russia to a college group. But there is no record of him traveling on July 26th. So how could he be in New Orleans and in Oak Ridge, Tennessee on the same day? Numerous people attested that Oswald was in Dallas throughout most of 1963, that he was a frequent visitor of the Carousel Club, that he was a friend of the club owner, Jack Ruby. These people include Dorothy Markham, who was Jack Ruby's girlfriend in the summer of 1963, and Carousel Club stripper Frances Irene Hiss, who later told various authors that Oswald offered to buy her a drink while she was on a break at the Carousel Club. Auto mechanic Robert Roy, who had a business in Dallas, saw Oswald in Dallas driving Ruby's car and taking it into Roy's shop for servicing. Western Union messenger Marshall Hicks delivered several telegrams to Oswald at an address on West 7th Street in Dallas. But as we know, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't drive. He didn't live in an apartment on West 7th Street in Dallas. He did not run errands for Jack Ruby. For much of 1963, he was living in New Orleans. He didn't even move to Dallas until September 26th, when he was also traveling to Mexico City by bus. So how is this possible? Warren Commission member and U.S. Senator Richard Russell had become concerned about evidence which seemed to suggest to him that there were two Oswalds. And he asked Army Intelligence Officer Colonel Philip Corso to conduct a discreet inquiry into the assassination. Corso contacted Francis Knight, head of the U.S. Passport Office. According to Armstrong, quote, Knight told Corso that there were two passports issued to Lee Harvey Oswald and they had been used by two different people. Now, let's take a moment to provide an audiovisual aid. This is very high-tech. Forgive me. And I want to thank Steve Marston for loaning me the expensive movie screen. First of all, you see here an image of this book that I've been talking about, Harvey and Lee. This is the cover of the book, and this is a picture of Oswald's military Department of Defense identification card. Okay, next slide. Here's the card blown up. It was issued to Oswald in September of 1959. Now, next slide, please. Now we see a large photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald. That was taken, as you can tell, right from the card. I would submit to you that there's something off about this picture. It doesn't really look like Oswald, does it? Or does it? Yeah. Does it or doesn't?
Yes.
Okay, now please look at this image closely. Go ahead, Cindy. Give them the next one. This is the image that you just saw, split into two. You can see two half images. I want you to look at them carefully. This is not the same man as this. Two different men fused together to make one composite image. Okay, that's it. That's our audio visual. Okay, so what is going on here? Here's the answer. Oswald was a spy for the CIA. And that explains why he got such amazing service when he applied for a discharge from the Marines. And that explains why he knew that a Russian consul in Helsinki was going to give him a visa in a matter of hours. And it explains why he got an office in New Orleans in the same building as Guy Bannister, who, if Oswald had really been what he purported to be, would have killed Oswald sooner than give him the time of day. And it explains why Bannister told his girlfriend, Delphine Roberts, who was concerned over Oswald's apparently left-wing activities when he was passing out fair play for Cuba placards in New Orleans, don't worry about him, he's one of ours. Not only was Oswald a spy for the CIA, but there were more than one Oswald, and they were all working for the CIA. That explains why so many people saw Oswald in Dallas when he was living in New Orleans. It explains why Oswald drove around in Jack Ruby's car, tried to pick up women in Jack Ruby's bar in Dallas, while he was a married man living, trying to head up the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. And it explains why Oswald, proof of this theory is offered in this book that I've been talking to you about. My personal belief is that there were probably more than two men who were working for the CIA under the alias of Lee Harvey Oswald. Two of them, as we have seen, look very much alike. The other guys, like the guy that went to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, or the guy who signed the register at the Atomic Energy Museum in Tennessee, need not have been a double of the other two. In support of this theory, I want you to consider two things. First of all, in the mid-70s, the Church Committee discovered that the CIA Special Investigations Group had a 201 file on Oswald. It was opened on December 9th, 1960, while Oswald was in the Soviet Union. Special Investigations Group only kept 201 files on CIA employees or CIA assets who it believed posed a counterintelligence risk. Since the agency had a 201 file on Oswald, he must have been an employee of the CIA. Now the second point. In September of 1960, an employee of the U.S. State Department's Office of Security asked for information from the CIA on its defector program. What is a defector program? I want to break away from my script just for a second. Well, what had happened in the United States history was from about 1920 to 1958, there were no defectors into Soviet Union. Suddenly then there was like 4 or 5, all within 1 year. Okay, that's the defector program. Did it happen just by accident? No, it was a program. But the CIA did not respond to the State Department request, and so then a few weeks later, on October 25th, 1960, Hugh Cumming of the State Department's Office of Intelligence and Research Bureau formally requested information from the CIA on its defector program. The CIA's Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Bissell, turned the request over to James Angleton. Under Angleton's direction, the CIA admitted that several persons were employed by the CIA in its defector program. Lee Harvey Oswald's name was on this list. And next to his name was the notation, secret. So, Oswald was with the CIA from at least 1959 until he returned to the United States in June of '62. How then do we know that he was CIA as late as November 22nd, 1963? We know because in the first moments after the hit, when all was in chaos, Lee Harvey Oswald walked out of the Elm Street entrance to the Texas School Book Depository. He walked a few blocks back toward downtown Dallas. He got on a bus and he headed toward his room on North Beckley Street. He was wearing a brown shirt and he was carrying a gray jacket. Moments later, Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig, who had been recognized as Officer of the Year just a few years earlier, saw Lee Harvey Oswald running across the lawn area below the grassy knoll toward Elm Street, stand out by the sidewalk, get into a pale green Rambler station wagon, and ride off. This man was wearing a white t-shirt. Later that day, after Oswald had been apprehended at the Texas Theater, he was brought into police headquarters for questioning. Craig wandered into a room where Dallas Police Captain Will Fritz was questioning Oswald. Craig recognized him as the man he saw running down the grassy knoll and getting into the Rambler. But he wasn't. The man who was being interviewed by Fritz was the first Oswald, the patsy, the guy who left by the front entrance and who got on the bus. The guy that Craig saw was the second Oswald. This theory is further supported by the fact that after the assassination, in the first few weeks after the assassination, more than 20 people told the FBI that they saw Lee Harvey Oswald in various locations, various times, and various situations when Oswald was known to be working in the school book depository. The Warren Commission, I would say the FBI had already made up its mind. who the assassin was going to be, and they buried that information. They did not give it to the Warren Commission. In conclusion, the Warren Commission report is not only flawed, it is completely wrong. There were not 3 shots. There were between 8 and 10 shots. There was a conspiracy, but it was a conspiracy based in the U.S. government. The man that we normally think of as Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who was married to Marina Oswald and who was killed by Jack Ruby, did not shoot Kennedy. He was, as he claimed, a patsy, a disgruntled CIA spy who was sucked into a tragedy he did not comprehend until late in the evening of November 22nd, when he was charged with the murder of John F. Kennedy. There were multiple Oswalds, each paid by the CIA to be expendable warriors in the Cold War with our communist foe. The Warren Commission report was not just a botched job, it was an intentional deception, a cover-up for a coup d'etat. Thank you.
So, just to remind you again, this is a time that we open things up to questions. Everybody can ask our 2 presenters, either one or the other or both. And again, I would like you to keep your questions to 2 minutes. And is there anybody who has a question? Bill?
My question would be, how did Jack Ruby know to be at the Dallas police station when Harvey Oswald was brought in and have a gun on him?
Well, that's an interesting question. Jack Ruby was, as you probably know, he was very much in evidence all over Dallas Police headquarters after the assassination, and probably, you know, he was everywhere. And he was at the meeting that took place on Saturday night, the press conference that took place at midnight on Saturday night. He was there sitting in back. And we've got a video of him. He even made a correction. The district attorney said something and misidentified the name of the organization that Oswald was affiliated with, and Ruby corrected him. But all I can tell you is that Ruby, we believe that Ruby called are you kidding? Is it already 2 minutes? No. Okay. We believe that Ruby called Dallas police and warned them not to move Oswald, because if they moved Oswald, Oswald would be killed. And he did that twice in one night, early Sunday morning. And we also know that Ruby had wired, I think, $25 to one of his dancers just moments before Oswald was taken out. And so people believe, and I believe, that Ruby did not want to kill Oswald. He was told to kill Oswald. Ruby himself knew that if he didn't kill Oswald, that he would be killed. And so he tried to avoid it, and he walked in and he waited for Oswald for something like 1 minute, and then he killed him. It was not, you know, it was a very tense moment in Ruby's life. And that's what I believe to be the case. I don't know that he knew, but he was there when they brought Ruby out, and he had waited for like 40 seconds, and there you have it.
I have an answer to that, or at least something to say. According to Ruby's own testimony, which is worth something, you have to start somewhere, and it's corroborated in many ways, he went to the Western Union office that Mike was talking about to wire some money to one of his dancers, and it was an hour and a half after he thought actually that Oswald had been moved. He walked, the Western Union office was right next to the Dallas County Jail. He got in line behind somebody else to send a Western Union telegram with money. He couldn't start until the other woman was done. All these transactions are timed. Then he went forward. His telegram was sent out at a certain time. He got up, he walked out, he walked across the street. He saw the commotion down in the basement down here. He said, maybe they haven't moved Oswald yet. He walked down the ramp, and as soon as he got to the bottom, the moment he got to the bottom, he saw them bringing Oswald out. He took out the gun and shot him. He says, you can believe it or not, he says, when I saw this asshole and saw that thought Jackie Kennedy was going to have to come to Dallas and testify because of this guy, he said, I just shot him. That was it. He'd had other chances to shoot him if he wanted to. He was in the Dallas police station more than once, armed because he always carried a gun because he carried money. He was a well-known guy around Dallas, well-known with the police, drifted out of the police station, had many friends and so forth. His story, it was a sudden thing just like that. He said he saw the guy, he said he pulled out the gun and shot him, and he intended to shoot him again when they hopped on him, and that was it. There's no evidence from Oswald or anybody else that's credible that said Oswald knew Ruby. The stuff that he's talking about is uncorroborated hearsay from books that people have written to make money, and there's thousands of them already.
Interesting that he never got a trial.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
My question is for both Mike and Don. Has anyone from the CIA come forward to corroborate the dual or four or however many different Lee Harvey Oswalds were out there?
No, it's not as far as I know, and it's been 56 years now. Plus, the evidence that Oswald had a 201 file for the CIA meant nothing. He's misstated what it means. It doesn't mean he's working for the CIA at all. And there's no evidence that's come up that he's had any connection whatsoever with the CIA. And the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Commission that were designed specifically to look into the CIA and the FBI found no evidence whatsoever that Oswald had any connection with the CIA in the sense of working for them. He had a file, of course, a counterintelligence file because he defected, and he had an FBI file because he returned and then was in the United States where he needed to be watched, right? But there's no evidence of any credible value whatsoever that's ever been brought up to the daylight and tested in a court of a public opinion where there's a transcript created, somebody's examined, and we could all go look at the transcript. That's never happened.
Let me answer that question. If I can find it here. Hold on. You asked, has anyone come forward? I can tell you a little bit. There's a guy named James Wilcott who worked as a paymaster in the CIA Far East Station, and he believed from talking with different CIA people that the CIA believed that Oswald was CIA. And he also said that there was something called the Oswald Project. And he told this to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and you can go online and look that up, and you can read it. But in answer to your question, and I want to bring this out, according to Richard Belzer's book, Hit List, it is mathematically impossible to attribute all of these deaths to accident. When I say deaths, I mean all of the witnesses and the people who may have been involved or may have known someone who was involved in the assassination. There were, quote, in the 14 years following the JFK assassination, there were a minimum of 70 unnatural deaths out of approximately 1,400 witnesses. The probability of that happening by chance is 1.4 to the minus 33rd power. Another way of saying it is 1 4/10 times 10 to the negative 33rd power. Or another way is 1 in 714 million, trillion, trillion. That's why no one has come forward.
Yes. Thank you.
This way.
I will. Yes.
Was there any forensic evidence presented to link Oswald to the rifle?
Say that again.
Was there any forensic
No,
evidence
repeat.
presented to link Oswald to the rifle, like fingerprints or powder traces?
Palm prints linked into the rifle. If you mean forensic evidence, there was also evidence that it had been sold by a Chicago group, sent to a post office box in the name of Fidel, and that he had that rifle and was photographed with it. Marina ultimately said that was his rifle. Yeah. And there was not forensic evidence, but there was evidence that he had apparently brought the rifle into the book depository in a paper bag constructed from wrapping material, and when they disassembled the rifle, they were able to fit it in the paper bag. And this is the blanket in which allegedly the rifle, fully assembled, was wrapped in the garage behind the Payne house outside of Dallas, that Marina said, yeah, that's where he keeps the gun right there.
Well, did they do any tests to determine if the rifle had been recently fired? I just can't touch that thing.
I can answer that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, they did test it, and they found that Oswald had not fired the gun, not fired the rifle. He had this telltale chemical on his hands, but you can get that chemical from moving books around. They tested his cheek, and there was nothing on his cheek. I think it's a nitrate test. They did test it, and it came up negative.
Who is that?
I can't tell you that. I
So,
don't
I
know.
mean, it's important. Is it
It might be.
hearsay, hearsay floating around, or is it? What?
No, it's
No,
not.
it
Go
was-
ahead, Louis.
Go ahead.
All right.
Thank you.
Dave.
Motivation is very important when we're trying to understand events that take place, especially crime. And I just want to be very clear in my mind the position of the two presenters here. Don and Mike, I want you both present to me the motivation of the single Harvey Oswald. You know, what his motivation was as a person, as a human being. And Mike, you said something about a coup at the end. Can you be clear, the double Oswald, or what is the motivation here behind your story and yours, Don? I just need to be clear here what you're talking about.
Your question to me again was, what was Oswald, if I believe there was one Oswald, what was his motivation?
Yeah.
He was a guy that was down on his luck. He had a thing about guns. He'd already taken a shot at Major General Edwin Walker. He talked about assassinating Nixon, or maybe it was Connolly. He looked like a guy, when he got the rifle 10 days after he got it, he tried to shoot somebody with it. What his motivation was, I don't know what his motivation was, other than he seemed to have an eager desire to shoot political figures.
Is it a loner?
Absolutely a lone wolf.
Mike?
Okay, I can answer your question. You know, I don't think that Oswald was a shooter. I don't think he was involved knowingly in the conspiracy. He was involved unwittingly in the conspiracy. He was the patsy. The people who killed Kennedy, well, Kennedy was a peaceful man, and Kennedy was not a fan of war. We know that Kennedy was in correspondence with Nikita Khrushchev to try to end the madness and avoid a nuclear war. And we also know that Kennedy did not supply air power to the Bay of Pigs. We know that Kennedy...
CIA operation.
Yeah, and we know that Kennedy, largely because of his own charisma and political strength, got the U.S. Congress to approve a strategic nuclear test ban in September of '63. I think the CIA and the military-industrial complex understood that Kennedy was not on their side. He had already issued National Security Agency Memorandum 263, which said that the U.S. was going to pull 1,000 troops out of Vietnam by the end of '63, and that he was seriously considering, my understanding of the matter is that he was seriously considering how he could pull everybody out of Vietnam by the beginning of '66 or the end of '65, after the election. So what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex was aware of this, and they removed him.
Any individuals you can name in the CIA conspiracy, Mike, that you know of?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, let's see, David Atlee Phillips was involved. Alan Dulles knew what was going on, for sure.
How do we know Alan Dulles knew what was going on?
Because he was the head of the CIA until Kennedy fired him.
Yes.
But he didn't just go back home and play golf.
And where's proof of this? That he knew?
It's a deduction that I make.
Okay.
Yeah. But David Atlee Phillips, who was later became the head CIA officer for the Western Hemisphere about 1965, David Atlee Phillips was the guy who was the propaganda director for the CIA for the overthrow of Guatemala. When they invented this attack from America and just played it on the radio, scared the shit out of everybody, and got the government to abdicate. That was David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips was seen by, what was his name, Mr. Vecchiana, in 1963 in a hotel in Miami, talking to Lee Harvey Oswald.
Who says?
Vecchiana says.
Who's he? Was he put on the road?
He was head of Alpha 66.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, well, do your homework.
Okay,
Yes.
he called me. I'm sorry, I thought he was going to email me. Don, you
Yes.
said that Lee Harvey Oswald was a defector to the Soviet Union, then he undefected, and he had to have had the CIA file, and he had to have been watched. Why the hell wasn't he watched? Especially if he got this rifle and tried to kill somebody, right?
He was watched. When he got back to the United States, the CIA checked in with him frequently and went to knock on his door and wanted to talk to him, not because they could compel him to talk. And it got to be such a problem that Marina Oswald complained to Lee that the FBI hostie from the FBI keeps coming around, and Lee Harvey Oswald sent a letter to the FBI bureau office in Dallas saying, if you don't stop bothering my wife, I want to blow up the FBI office.
He should have been in jail.
Well,
Go ahead. I'm not going to answer that.
Okay. Yes.
It's very similar to this lady's question, but if Lee Harvey Oswald was on the CIA and the FBI watch list, and they must have known that Kennedy was going to be in Dallas, and that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Dallas, how the hell did he get into the empty Saturday book depository and not caught by the FBI or the CIA?
well, first off, the FBI had primary responsibility for watching Oswald back when he was in the United States. And they checked in with him from time to time, but they had no legal hold over him. They had no reason to think necessarily that he was going to shoot Kennedy. And in fact, when it happened, Hosty, the guy that ran the bureau in Dallas, panicked, and he started to try to destroy some paper before they decided we better not do this. And the paper would indicate that, God, I knew this guy was going to be around, and maybe I should have done something.
I would like to try to answer that. Let's see, could you repeat your question, please, Ellen?
Yes, if Oswald,
Oh, okay, wait a minute, I now know what I was gonna say. It was, amazingly, the FBI took Oswald off their watch list approximately October 1963. Just goddamn, I just don't know why they did it, but they took him off the watch list.
Well, they visited his home in Marina several times in that time space after he was supposedly taken off the watch list. So he may have been taken off the watch list, but he was watched. Hostie's the last name of the FBI guy in charge of the Dallas office, kept badgering Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina, just, what are you doing, what's going on, and they were both fed up with it. So he was not off a list, or if he was off a list, the FBI agent in Dallas was checking in on him regularly to the point where it upset Lee.
Ellen?
Well, on this connection with the CIA, I've always thought it was very strange that when Harvey Oswald and Marina moved to Dallas, they ended up renting from Ruth Payne, who happened to be good friends with this guy, George DeMornshield, who worked for the CIA. And it just, and not only that, I believe from reading these books, that it was Ruth Payne that got Lee Harvey Oswald the job at the Texas Book Depository. So
That's correct.
those are, and Ruth Payne and DeMornshield were part of this conservative white Russian club that met socially, and they introduced Lee to their friends, and but the fact that he would end up renting a room from Ruth Payne and she would get him the job at the book depository seems to me pretty incredible.
Well, he rented the room from her because she would teach Marina. Marina wanted to learn Russian, and so Ruth Payne rented the room to both Oswalds in exchange for learning Russian.
Yes.
As far as DeMornshield, you mentioned...
Marina was Russian.
What?
Marina was
Russian.
She wanted to learn English?
What
Ruth Payne wanted to learn Russian.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had it. Ruth Payne wanted to learn Russian, so she had Marina, and she gave space and housing to Marina. As far as Mornshield, you mentioned that he was an agent for the CIA. He was not. He was a world traveler who was overtly debriefed, like many thousands of travelers when they came back from their world tours, to say, what did you see? Tell me what you saw. He had a very open, above relationship with the CIA, the same kind of overt relationship the CIA had with thousands of other people who were world travelers and were willing to talk to the CIA. What did you see when you were in Turkey? Tell me what's going on in Afghanistan. That was the relationship. It was all over and above board, and everybody knew it. It wasn't like...
They didn't ask me when I came back from Israel.
They didn't ask you. Well,
No.
you didn't have a relationship with the CIA, an overt one, where they wanted to debrief you, and apparently they didn't think you were enough of a significant world traveler with information to share.
Well, they got that one right.
Yeah.
Yes, Silver.
Don, you mentioned that Lee Harvey Oswald was, if he was part of a conspiracy, that perhaps he would have been an unwitting component of a conspiracy. Is it possible that there's some kind of hybrid between your two theories, that someone saw this nutty guy and weaponized him as part of a greater...
I would say that's fanciful. Anything's possible. There's 1,000 conspiracy books that prove it.
There's no evidence to suggest that?
No, zero.
Besides the rental agreement and the whole setup there between the CIA agent and...
The rental agreement? being.
Well, or I'm sorry, there was a woman that got him the job that was involved with the CIA.
Right.
Ruth Payne.
Ruth Payne. But there's nothing that I'm aware of suspicious about Ruth Payne other than she wanted to learn Russian. that itself might be suspicious.
Can I?
Yes, yes.
Well, actually, there's quite a bit that's suspicious about Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne, oy vey. I can tell you this. I don't have a list of all of her connections with U.S. government agencies, but I can tell you that she has a lot of family relations. Her sister did work for the CIA. Her father worked for the USAID, the U.S. Information Agency. She had, I believe this is a stretch, forget it, but let's just say she had quite a lot of connections with both the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community. I also I don't know if Don is aware of this, but Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly purchased this rifle from Chicago on March 20th. Just by happenstance, Ruth Payne's calendar was looked at by the FBI. Somebody looked at it, and I've read that she had March 20th circled on her calendar. Kind of a coincidence. She couldn't explain why.
Maybe it was her birthday.
So, why did he kill the cop if he didn't kill Kennedy?
He didn't kill the cop.
Oh, so that was,
Yeah.
okay.
Even
though the eyewitnesses were there?
Okay. Yeah, you know, I've read a whole bunch of different reports that different people say that there were 2 people who killed the cop. There was 1 person that killed the cop. I don't believe any of it.
How many people were there when he killed the cop, Mr. Sampson?
12 different people testified that they saw part or all of the shooting. 12. 5 of them identified Oswald in a lineup after he'd been arrested.
Yes.
2 questions. What good would a job in a book depository do you unless you knew the route of the presidential motorcade? And is there any following of the money between the CIA and Oswald? Is there any financial connection we can establish?
No financial connection has been established that I'm aware of.
Yikes, there's no money to follow?
I'm not aware of, any check stubs from the CIA that have been found.
Did Oswald have a big bank account that would explain anything other than a book depository job?
He had $13 in his pocket and Marina had about $120. That's all the money to their name was ever discovered.
Okay, and what about the job at the book depository if you didn't know the presidential motorcade route?
Well, he got October 15th, he got the job, October 15th, he got the job at the book depository, but they didn't decide on the final route that Kennedy was going to take until about 5 days before the assassination on the 22nd. It was announced earlier in November that it looked like Kennedy was coming to Dallas for a visit.
Louis?
Yes.
In regard to the conspiracy, years ago I heard that Lyndon Johnson had been suspected of being involved. Has there been anything in terms of association with Johnson and CIA and any of these other?
Lots of the conspiracy books cite Johnson as being one of the principals. He would be like 6th or 7th on the list coming down. CIA, FBI, Mafia, Castro people, and pretty soon you get down to maybe 6th or 7th, you get down to Lyndon Johnson.
I would just say, I tend to think that Johnson was not involved. That's my personal opinion. I know that Johnson had a mistress, and the mistress wrote a book in which she writes that Johnson told her the night before that Kennedys aren't going to make fun of me anymore. But it doesn't belong it doesn't make sense to me
Well, I
because
have,
of so much else that he did.
yeah, I have to say one thing. My husband's relatives knew Lyndon Johnson as a young man and as a politician in Texas. And they were not very happy with him as a person or as a leader. And that's what I was wondering.
I think that Johnson, had the character that he was ruthless and he wanted power. He was very ambitious. He had the motive, but I just don't think he did it this time. He did a lot of other bad things, but not that. I don't think.
Lewis?
Okay, wait, David.
So I have a quick question for Mike and then one for Don. Mike, isn't it true that when Oswald said that he was a patsy, isn't the word patsy a common term by intelligence people used? It's not, it was very specific use that he termed that he himself was a patsy.
I'll tell you the truth, David, I don't know that. But I do know this. In that afternoon period where Roger Craig came into the office where Will Fritz was interviewing Oswald, and Craig said to Oswald that I saw you get into a green Rambler and drive off, ride off. Someone else picked you up and you rode off. And he said, that's Ruth Payne's car. Don't bring her into this. And then he said, now everyone will know what I am.
And a quick question for Don. Don, when Kennedy's body was brought to Parkland Hospital and was attended by 4 or 5 doctors intimately familiar with gunshot wounds, dealing with gunshot wounds all the time, and Malcolm Perry and others, there was 5 or 6, all testified that the wound in his throat was an entrance wound. And they were the first people to see it before it was messed with for the tracheotomy. What evidence, why do you think, how did the Warren Commission discredit the doctors that saw him first, intimately associated, experienced doctors, intimately associated with gunshot wounds? How did the Warren Commission come to the conclusion that this little wound that was measured 4 or 5 millimeters in diameter was an exit wound, since exit wounds always are much bigger than an entrance wound?
Neither Carrico nor Perry ever testified that they were entrance wounds. They spoke at press conferences, everybody was rushing questions at them. They sort of acquiesced in that maybe they were entrance wounds. They agreed 100% with the autopsy pathologist that they were exit wounds. Nobody in the emergency room ever turned Kennedy over and saw the other 2 bullet holes. Nobody. And as far as the big chunk blown off his head, that was a bullet that entered back here and blew it off. And it's very clear in the Zapruder film, it's all blown forward. And both Connolly and his wife said his brains and blood were blown all over us.
Have you seen the unclassified frames from the Zapruder film?
The unclassified what?
The unclassified frames from the Zapruder film.
No, I don't.
Well, if you saw those
Yeah.
that were just declassified,
Yeah.
you would see his brains going out the back.
Oh, now it's going out the back.
Yes.
How did it get all over the Connolly and his wife? Were they not telling the truth about it? They were soaked in it. Jackie had some on her too because he fell over in her lap.
He fell over on her lap. He did.
Mike?
Yeah.
Don, you had mentioned that Oswald had shot at a general?
Major General Edwin Walker was a very controversial right-wing general that was cashiered out of the military because instead of teaching his troops military stuff, he was lecturing them on the John Birch Society and its virtues. And they said, this is too much. He was very high profile at the time. They got him out of the military. He happened to be living somewhere in the Dallas area, I forget where. Oswald found where he was living. He got photographs. He created a map. He took notes in a notebook that were all later discovered by the Warren Commission people because Marina Oswald turned them over. It just so happened that it was an opportunity for Oswald to shoot somebody high profile like that because the guy lived relatively close.
And he missed him.
He missed him.
And they know that he tried to shoot him?
No, they didn't know it then. They only found out later when Marina Oswald told the cops that he'd taken a shot with this rifle at Walker. That's the only.
You were saying that they later, Warren report corroborated the gunshots in Oswald that he was a sharpshooter.
Right. The head of the marksmanship branch of the Marine Corps came in and testified and said this guy shot 212 hits out of 250.
How long before then? How far back did he do that great?
Well, he was in the Marines, and he got out of
about 1957.
Okay, 57,
something like
58,
that.
and 63 was the assassination. Right.
Right, so 5 years-ish.
Plus, when he bought the rifle, the Manokur Kakano, he practiced with it. He took it, not only dry fired it, he live fired it at various shooting ranges, and he was very familiar with the gun.
Right, so they knew he was this incredible sharpshooter.
Incredible is the wrong word. He was a sharpshooter. He was a Marine. They trained these guys to shoot. I was a sharpshooter.
Right.
I don't know what distance the targets were, but I was a sharpshooter.
He could make these incredible shots because those shots sound like they were pretty incredible.
Well, the marksmen for the Marine Corps said with a 4-power telescope on top of the rifle, it wasn't a hard shot at all.
But they knew he could shoot like that, and yet
I'm sorry.
they
I
let
have to see.
they didn't keep watching.
Yes.
Mike, you presented a slide where it showed a picture of President Kennedy's jacket with a bullet wound, or looked like a bullet wound. But that doesn't coincide with what you were saying, or how does that coincide, I would ask, with what the Warren Commission wrote? Because what you presented, or what the Warren Commission said, was there was 2 shots. One through the back base of the skull, the occipital bone, blew out the right temple, and then the other one that entered through lower in the neck. But that's very different than what we saw on that picture. So I'm just wondering, how was that brought up in the Warren Commission, or how was that explained?
I don't know really how to answer the one about the suit coat stuff. I know that the Warren Commission didn't have all the materials that they needed at the time. A lot of them had been sequestered because the government officials were afraid this stuff would disappear into the public domain and be auctioned off and stuff like that. I know that there was a matching up of the suit jacket and the shirt he was wearing by the pathologist somewhere down the line. They said it was a perfect fit.
Well, I think the Warren Commission distorted tremendous amount of factual evidence, and I think they just made it up.
Well, part of the CIA, were the CIA put pressure on the Warren Commission, you saying? Conspiracy.
There's other people who want to talk.
Okay.
2 minutes.
And who?
She did, right?
There were all sorts of them. Oh, yeah, okay, right.
Mike, I wanted to know what you thought of the conspiracy theory that it was the mafia because of Bobby Kennedy.
I can answer your question. The CIA worked very closely with the mafia. They were like brothers in arms. And the CIA and the mob wanted the same thing.
Wow.
For different reasons.
Right.
They wanted Kennedy dead. And the mob wanted Kennedy dead because he was going to screw up the mafia's business. and the CIA wanted him dead because he was going to bring peace. So they could work together. They did work together, as Don said, that it was found that they were working together to kill Fidel Castro. And, the CIA, the Warren Commission did not find that they were working together to assassinate the president, but they didn't get all the information, and it was basically Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover decided who the shooter was, and all the facts were tailored to fit that theory.
But also, I just remember them saying, you won't find everything out after he was killed for 50 years. That seems strange to me.
Was that Johnson who said that? Or who said that?
It was the government just said things would be sealed.
Right. And I do believe that they were correct. I mean, I think that they had the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and it started out really strong, and they got rid of that guy, and they put in somebody else to direct it and to get them. Yet, even the House Select Committee did conclude that there was a high probability that more than one shooter shot John F. Kennedy. A lot of people don't know that, and I don't believe Don knows that.
I do.
That's what they concluded. Okay.
Do I have a chance to answer?
Oh, of course.
They concluded that on the basis of an audio recording taken from a motorcycle dictaphone that nobody could interpret. So they gave it to a high-powered guy who did audio research, and he did miles of charts, and he with spikes in them that you couldn't tell there were gunshots, but he said they're gunshots, and he had 4 of them, and he said they came from different parts of Dealey Plaza, and one of them came from the Grassy Knoll area. And so the House Committee, even though they said all the bullets that hit Kennedy were fired by Oswald from the school book depository, that if in fact there was a shot fired from the Grassy Knoll, even though it hit nothing that we know of, then there must have been a conspiracy. Either, other than that, 2 people at the same time by accident were in the same place. However, in making the judgment, there was a probable conspiracy based on the audio recording. They said, we want this looked at by the Department of Justice. It went to the Department of Justice. They did their own experiments, and they said the earlier recording was nonsense. You were talking about spikes that were occurring in noise at a time when the motorcycle, which they took it from, was in a different place and so forth. And so they said there was no conspiracy, thereby rejecting the House Select Committee assassination's verdict on probable conspiracy.
Yes.
I'm just curious on how would you answer Mike's analysis of the magic bullet? Because that does sound...
I'll go through it if you want. Okay. They did. When they had the Zapruder film, and they were able to place the presidential limousine with respect to landmarks pretty much exactly where it was at the time they believe the neck shot occurred and the head shot. And when they put it at 59 yards out where the neck shot occurred, you couldn't, Connolly was right behind Kennedy, and it was virtually impossible.
Front.
Connolly
Was it in front of
No, Connolly, well, yeah, right, that's, he was behind Kennedy from the viewpoint of there, but he was in front, okay. And so you couldn't, if a bullet hit Kennedy's neck, 5 inches of neck, and went through, it had no place to go without being a magic bullet and going this way, except hit Connolly. When the bullet left the rifle, it was leaving at 2,100 feet per second. When it arrived at 59 yards out, it was moving at 1,900 feet per second. When it passed through 5 inches of Kennedy's neck, it was moving at 17 feet per second. Enough oomph to get sliced through Connolly's body and his wrist and lodge itself in the thigh where it fell. There were extensive experiments done on it, and to figure out what it was like going through Kennedy's neck. They shot it through 5 inches of meat, 5 inches of gelatin. They kept doing different experiments before they came up with a number they figured was reasonable, that if it went in at 1900 feet per second, it came out 5 inches later at 1700 feet per second, and immediately hit Connolly. There was nowhere for the bullet to go. Nowhere. He was right behind him, or in front of him, if you want to, depending on the viewpoint you're talking about.
Somebody who hasn't, okay, I guess we're in the kind.
No, we're not finished.
There's just a wonderful book out a few years ago, Robert Caro's fourth volume of his monumental LBJ biography, and he takes you minute by minute through this entire day because he actually was the first person to read the notes that were written by each of the 26 Secret Service men on the detail to Dallas that day. As soon as they got back to Washington that night, their first job was to go to the office and write down everything they remembered. And nobody looked at those notes for decades until Caro did when he was researching the Path to Power, I think it's volume 4. But it's an astoundingly, almost documentary, minute by minute. He's got all of Clint Hill's stuff from being in the limo when the shooting was.
Is there anything that you read that bears directly on the controversy on the stage here that would shed some light on?
Only that it's, LBJ probably, he had some very negative experiences at the hands of the Kennedys, but that's a big leap of faith to put him into a conspiracy that was going to assassinate him. He was treated very badly.
So, Mike, you talked about the bullet using very little weight. I don't know anything about bullets and what would cause a bullet to lose weight, and why should it have lost more weight than it did?
Because when a bullet goes through bone, it breaks apart. It's not made out of diamond, it's made out of lead. And it breaks apart and it shatters a bone. And it loses parts of its mass, parts of its weight. That's why.
John?
Well, speaking of the magic bullet thing, they have good evidence that when the bullet entered Connolly, it was yawing slightly. That is, it's lost its true rifling to go absolutely perfectly straight. And that's because it nicked the edge of the throat coming through and it bruised it there, and picked up a little bit of English, thinking in terms of pool. And so that when it went into Connolly, it wasn't truly straight, it was yawing slightly like this, and they could tell that very easily by examining Connolly's wound where the entrance was. So it wasn't, whatever it wasn't a clean shot from a rifle into Connolly. It was a shot that hit something to cause it to yaw slightly before it went into Connolly, and they believe that was when it passed through Kennedy's neck. It just nicked the thorax.
Can you speak at all to body parts that seem to go backwards from Kennedy's body, which would seem to indicate a bullet coming from?
I'm not sure what you mean by body part. You mean brain matter?
Brain matter, the bone.
I don't believe any of the stuff he said about brain stuff going back. I believe Connolly and his wife, when they said they were showered with the brain matter. Showered with the brain matter.
Piece of that Jackie Kennedy picked up.
Excuse me?
The parts that his wife picked up on.
I know nothing about his wife picking up any of that. A lot of it arises in conspiracy books, and there's 1,000 of them. Most of it is sourceless hearsay or untested allegations that have never really been tested in any meaningful way. And with the number of investigators that were investigating the case for the Warren Commission, unless all of them were absolutely corrupt, I would have expected things like that to have found their way into the Warren Commission to be able to have a good airing about it, and there wasn't anything.
Yeah, let's see. 3 decades after the assassination, a medical expert did tests on the x-rays that were published in the Warren Commission report, and he determined that they were fake. From 1993 to 1995, David Mantic, a radiation oncologist with a PhD in physics, tested the autopsy x-rays at the National Archives in Washington using an optical densitometer. Mantic measured the bone density of the x-ray images at the rear of Kennedy's skull and compared it to the bone density in the front of Kennedy's skull. And he determined that the two bone densities were dramatically different, that they were from different people. The Warren Commission x-rays were composites.
Yeah.
We clearly all see in the famous film of Kennedy being shot, it's a Bruder film, that Jackie Kennedy starts to climb back and retrieve something from the back of the car. What do you think she was doing?
I don't know. I don't know.
Should we say the
Whether she was retrieving something or whether she was trying to pull up the guy from the car behind her that was the Secret Service man that was trying to get into the car. That's what she was back there doing. He was trying to get up. There's a picture of her leaning to try to grab his hand to pull it.
So her main concern was the Secret Service?
Well, a guy's trying to climb in the back of the car, and right where she is, and she puts her hand out for it.
Jackie was very helpful. And, you know, just moments after her husband's brains were blown out of his head, she wanted to help this CIA guy. She was a nice woman.
You mean she took time out to look for pieces of bone back there?
Okay.
Yeah, wait, I want to get all.
Let me make a little announcement.
Yes.
We're going to end this at 10 o'clock, and we've got about 12 minutes to 10. So we'll just keep asking questions, but yeah.
12 more minutes.
Yeah, Mike, the book I read by John Stockwell, who was the highest ranking CIA agent, wrote the book, and he said, you know, from the CIA, he said there were 8 to 10 shots fired. The only effective policeman or agent was that was Jackie Kennedy's special guard. And that was the one that jumps on the back of the car.
Yeah, Clint Hill.
And for her, he said to the driver, get to the emergency, because the driver was stuck and had slowed down at the right angle when you're supposed to keep the caravan going because of the safety, and at the point where the van slowed down, the shots were fired. And the driver wasn't going to do anything until the one Secret Service man that was really on duty, all the other cops they weren't there to help at all. There's evidence that they did nothing.
Bill, do you have a question?
And did you, thank you for that. So what about that? What about the agent on the back of the car?
I really don't know how to answer your observation. I think it's a good observation. I'm glad that you read the book by Stockwell, and I think that Robert Groden, another person who's written widely about the assassination, also said that he believes there were 8 to 10 shots fired. But I can't really comment on Clint Hill, yay or nay. I mean, Hill was an important figure. I think he said a lot of important things. Lewis.
No, I was just
no.
See if
Nothing. No.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And then.
Double dipping.
Well,
Could
we're
each
at that
of you
point.
I'm not clear, based on both of your explanations, whether it's your impression that the right front of Kennedy's brains was blown out, or the back part here? Because pictures I've seen of Kennedy at Parkland Hospital show the front of his head pretty much intact, and the actual gaping wound and missing brain was not immediately apparent when you just looked at him. But the way both of you described it, it wasn't clear to me what your impression was of that fatal wound. Was it this part missing, or this part missing, or this part missing?
Right here. Right here. These diagrams, these markup diagrams here, were done for the House Select Committee on Assassination based on the findings of the 9 forensic pathologists that confirmed the findings of the original autopsy. And this was the artist did the rendition based on the 9 forensic pathologists, their description of it, and this is what they showed. And as far as the from the back view, there's where the shot went in that came out the neck, and right there is the shot that went through the head. And there's the angle right there, and this is what was blown out, the center right front.
Well, my understanding of it is that it was this part here.
Was blown out?
This part was blown out, and he was shot from the front.
Well, the 9 forensic pathologists, or the 17, saw it differently. So I'm in no position to question it really, unless they're conspirators in some way.
How come they didn't turn him over and look at the back? How do they know those wounds in the back? Well,
They weren't pathologists. They were there to save the man's life. Once he was declared dead, the Secret Service put the body in the casket. They had no interest in doing a complete examination. That's for an autopsy. None at all. Nobody in the room there at the time that I'm aware of, and certainly no one that testified, saw the wounds in the back. Nobody. In fact, you'd think the people, the doctors that allegedly said, oh, those are wounds at the front, don't you think they wonder where it went? I mean, wouldn't you want to know then if that's a frontal wound, if you really care whether it's front or back, and they didn't, they just wanted to save the man's life. But if they really cared, wouldn't they want to see, did a bullet come out? How would you make a judgment on this in that sort of situation where you're not a pathologist if you don't examine the man completely pathologically and see where the other end of it is? It's like nobody there saw it in the Parkland Hospital. Nobody.
I think that, I believe that Don is correct, but I think it was seen at Bethesda.
Yes, Don.
Isn't it interesting that when he took office, one of the first things he did is rescind Kennedy's order for issuing troops in Vietnam, thus leading to the escalation of the Vietnam War?
Yes.
I don't know if you care to comment on that.
It's true that that's what he did. That was one of his very first actions. I don't think that necessarily means he was in on the assassination, but I do think that the people who killed Kennedy, Johnson's politics were much more in alignment with them than the Kennedys were. Although I have read that when Johnson did not foment a war against Cuba, the CIA in Miami went crazy. They were extremely pissed off. They basically were thinking we did all this for nothing.
Don?
No.
Okay. And yes.
For Mike, you said, I think, if I'm quoting you correctly, that Jack Ruby was told to shoot whoever that guy was in the police.
Oswald.
Okay, well, Oswald or the other guy, or one of the 12 of them. So my question is it your understanding that he was told by the CIA and he had a previous connection with the CIA? Who told him to shoot that guy?
I don't know. I don't know who told him, but I do know that he did run guns to Cuba and worked for the CIA. He worked for them in the late 50s, and he was running guns to. He was a man who would pretty much do anything for a buck. I don't think he didn't have high political principles. He was in it for the money, and it is well known that he ran guns to Cuba to overthrow Castro.
Nothing.
So maybe one last question. Huh?
I'm always curious about what happened to Jack Ruby.
Yeah.
Jack Ruby died of cancer before he
Yeah.
He was convicted, he died of cancer.
Yeah, he died
Very
in
soon,
jail.
3 years.
68. He died in
68. Right.
or early 69. He lived about 5 years
Right.
after he killed Oswald.
Why did he ever get a trial?
No trial. I can't answer that question, Ellen. I don't know.
Why what?
Why was he never tried?
He was tried, wasn't he?
Yeah, probably was.
tried.
Okay, one last question.
Were there no photographs of Kennedy's body in these head wounds? I don't know.
Yeah, there were photographs. The autopsy pathologist took photographs and X-rays, and the Warren Commission didn't have access to all of them at the time because they were still under seal. By the time they got back to the House Select Committee on Assassination, that's when they brought in these forensic dental people and X-ray people to be sure they were working from the same materials, that the materials they had were in fact Kennedy. So we did take photographs and they did take X-rays.
And one discrepancy, you're saying there were as many as 13 shots, and you were saying...
I said 10, 8 to 10.
8 to 10, and you're saying
According to
What about the witnesses?
according to the Dallas police, who really did the basic investigation, they said 3 or 4 shots is what most people were saying. There was no testimony from anybody, either to the Warren Commission or in statements to the Dallas police, that 8 or 10 shots were fired. Although it was an echo chamber, there was a lot of disorientation, and a fair number of people went towards the grassy knoll, and given all the buildings there with the sound bouncing off, it was only the people in the caravan, in the motorcade, and the people close to the book depository that immediately thought that's where the shots had come from.
And how many?
3.
3.
Well, I would just say that it is difficult to know the truth about this. Certainly, my view was that Kennedy was shot 3 times himself, and Connolly was shot twice. And there was that bullet that ricocheted off the sidewalk. It was like 100 yards from the motorcade, missed everything. So that's, what is that? That's 6, I believe. And then there was another shot that apparently was shot at the beginning and didn't hit anyone. So that would be 7. And there may have been others.
Should we stop?
Sure.
I think that we're going to stop.
Yeah.